What is your first instinct upon hearing the term black metal? What are the first mental images that come to mind? Are they images of ancient mystical kingdoms? Are they images of desecration, violence, and evil? Or something else? We all know the names, the stories, and the locations like the back of our hand. And for more than 3 decades, this history has continued to serve as the dominating backdrop for media coverage on black metal. Despite its emergence out of Kolbotten in the 90s, despite its waning interest in burning churches, and despite its loosened ties to right-wing extremism, black metal, to this day, still struggles to shake this association to Satanism, danger, and violence. In a recent article in The Guardian, the writer describes how she, as a teenager, was drawn into black metal by its alluring aesthetic and raw musical expression. As she grew older, however, she started scrutinizing NSBM lyrics and felt deceived. In her view, the seductive qualities of black metal had made her willingly oblivious before her conviction that black metal was a Trojan horse for unsavory political ideals. This article, among many others, illustrates how mainstream media tends to judge the whole genre by a very small and unrepresentative set of data points. Arguably, if we wish to understand black metal as an art form, there may be value in separating it from its decades of projections spawned from a handful of scandalous episodes, not least because several of the recurring themes in black metal have remained just as relevant for just as long. Black metal has always been raw, unapologetic, and entirely uninterested in being an art form that accommodates the general mass. Art is, in the end, communication. And I think it's time we hear it out by moving away from sensationalist public discourse and instead asking ourselves, which themes and concepts are found at the heart of black metal music? And can these themes help us discern where the anger and hostility actually comes from? Let's find out. If we begin with the cover art and visual language of black metal, we see a striking consistency in the themes that occur and also in how these themes are related to one another. In the classic blue cover albums, we see vast, cold, and ancient landscapes which seem very disconnected from the kinds of comfort that we as humans take for granted. The landscapes are cold, vast, and indifferent to human needs such as shelter, nourishment, and intimacy. When a human-like figure appears, she is seldom the centerpiece of the picture. More often, the figure appears as a side character presented in a much larger context. In cases where a person or human is the centerpiece of a picture, they are not presented like someone who works a 9-to-5, pays their bills, and leads a normal social life. No, these portraits, including those of the artists themselves, are often distorted in ways that make them function more as vessels for emotion or concept or inner state rather than a portrait of a human. For example, we see demons, gods, and creatures from Norse mythology. Another theme we see repeatedly in the cover art is depictions of natural landscapes like mountains, forests, frozen plains, and scorched landscapes. However, these are not pastoral postcard-like pictures of nature. On the contrary, nature in black metal is more often presented as something vast, ancient, and harsh, something that does not exist to primarily accommodate us humans. Mires, mud, ice, and bare rock are difficult enough to walk through, let alone live in. Although some cover art includes human-made structures like castles or ruins, these buildings are often presented as something unattainable, unreachable. They appear high above us on a mountain, in the far distance, or in the form of a collapsed ruin. Taken together, this visual language conveys a feeling of vastness, grimness, and, importantly, a decentralization of human importance in relation to something much greater. But what about the anger? To be fair, media portrayals of black metal as something violent and hostile is not drawn out of thin air. A great deal of black metal is actually openly hateful and violent. It is full of battle imagery, war, and violent emotional expressions. We see albums named Battles in the North and Black Metal ist Krig, and lyrics like Cascades of Blood and Brains and Hatet brinner i våra ådror. The same goes for the hostility against Christians with cover art like this, alongside plentiful lyrics describing in detail how Christians are receiving revenge. Paired with its musical expression, the idea that black metal is angry, violent, and hostile against Christians is actually right. However, this picture is very incomplete. In capacity of armchair psychologist, my instinct is that anger seldom appears out of thin air, and I would go as far as to suggest that for every expression of anger that we see, there are 50 sadnesses that we don't. When we dive deeper into the lyrical world of black metal, my instinct is that the melancholy, the grief, the sadness, and the liminal feelings occur just as often. Into the silent shadows I crawl, upon the throne so cold. Atmosphere of melancholy, I will forever burn. The sadness in these lyrics is often sprung out of grief that is tied to a deep sense of longing, even yearning for something lost, stolen, or impossibly distant. In many cases, the losses described afflicted a group of people as opposed to an individual person. One of the most recurring themes in black metal is the story of how the North was robbed of its original faith, its own continuity, and even identity when Christianity took hold. We see this in songs like En vind av sorg by Darkthrone and 1000 Years of Rain by Enslaved. Vindir describes in detail what exactly the Christians took. Thor's hammer was replaced with a cross. Song traditions were replaced with hollow words, and farmers' wit was replaced with social status. This is one of the most striking things about how the grief over a place, an age, or spiritual orientation is described in black metal lyrics. Det som en gång var, nu borte. Vi døde ikke. Vi har aldri levd. We never died. We never lived. To grieve something, in a sense, is to acknowledge that it mattered, and, in a way, that you are also longing for it. This reach, this yearning and longing can be seen everywhere in black metal lyrics. For instance, Vindir sings, "The longing is like the gap in my soul, endless." While Emperor sings, "May we touch the black flames of the past again." This longing is especially pronounced for ancient times and toward ways of belonging to something larger than oneself. I would even go as far as to say that this longing extends to fictional realms as well, as several bands have kept coming back to Tolkien's world of Lord of the Rings. Tolkien's influence on black metal is made evident already in the band names themselves. Gorgoroth is a region in Mordor. Isengard is the fortress where the Uruk-hai are created. And Burzum is the black speech for darkness. We see songs, entire albums, and band concepts that draw on Lord of the Rings. Yet, Tolkien, in this context, is rarely used for faithful rereading. More often, Tolkien's work carries a symbolic and atmospheric value, especially through the darker parts of his universe and his ancient, grand, and unpopulated environments. The Lord of the Rings was evidently a shared point of reference for several artists, many of whom seem to have encountered his worlds independently and found them deeply resonant. And beyond simple escapism, I would say that this reflects a desire for a world in which place, language, fate, and collective memory feel more immediately present and connected than they do in modern life. Beyond Lord of the Rings, Immortal has their own world called Blashyrk, that is stripped from urban modernity and comfort. Taken together, we find lyrics describing a deep yearning for belonging with something greater, and in some cases, a deeply felt kinship with the past and resonance with inaccessible worlds. What makes this especially striking is the equally persistent theme of estrangement from present time and space. Many artists describe themselves as misplaced, isolated, and fundamentally alien to the world in which we live. We see a profound sense of solitude that is sometimes described as something painful. Vinder sings, "I live in the wilderness to avoid human emptiness." But the solitude sometimes also implies sovereignty, like Immortal sings, "In my kingdom I enter into my own world." This perceived sovereignty becomes especially clear in the repeated imagery of kings, emperors, masters, and guardians, with band names such as Emperor and song titles like King and Lord of the Storms. The leader described is often Satan, but sometimes the artist places themselves in the role of sovereign, watcher, or defender. This becomes evident in lines such as, "I am the Almighty One, the one with the wisdom," or "We are the tyrants that guard the land." And this feels important, because this implies that the artists keep placing themselves in positions of authority, in realms of grimness, eternity, and cosmic scale. And scale may be one of the most important themes in black metal altogether. Scale is made apparent in the way that natural landscapes are described in a literal sense, as we hear about mountains, horizons, and glacial valleys. But vastness also occurs as something temporal. For example, lyrics on eternity, ancient times, and forgotten ages. Beyond that, black metal often reaches for concepts so large and vast that they strain human comprehension altogether. With titles like "Circling Above Time Before Time," we see repeated texts on infinity, oblivion, cosmic darkness, timelessness, and a collapse of human conception of scale. This brings me to an extremely prominent pattern in black metal lyrics, namely that the boundaries between the self and these landscapes seemingly dissolves. Tusen kalde vintre med kun kulde og forakt. Det finnes ingen sommer uten vinter. I gaze into the moon, which makes my mind clear as crystal lakes. My eyes cold as the darkest winter nights. Lyrics such as these makes it incredibly difficult for me to reduce black metal to a mere expression of anger or theatrical oppositional behavior, because black metal is evidently challenging. We get abrasive sound, we get extreme aesthetics, and we get objections against social conventions. But at the same time, we are also challenged intellectually. Black metal provides alternative views on the significant self versus the larger picture. By extension, it challenges current views on how people with divergent abilities are valued in our society. We are also challenged with philosophical ideas that are extremely large and abstract. For instance, in the alternative interpretations of space and time. But at the same time, as black metal moves in extremely abstract worlds, it can also be deeply concrete. In fact, much black metal simply describes land and landscapes. Some artists devote entire albums and songs to specific regions and places. Vindir keeps coming back to his home, Sogndal, and Tåke returns to Hordaland, and several artists even sing in their own dialects. However, as often as nature functions as metaphor for a felt inner state or emotion, the repeated use of mountains, black night skies, and horizons suggests something else too, namely a deep reverence before these landscapes. Land is often described as something ancient, enduring, and even spirited. In addition to using land as metaphors for a felt inner state or emotion, land is often described as something sacred. And importantly, the temper and the spirit of the land often feels deeply embodied within the artists. Mayhem sings, "I have been old since the birth of time." Emperor sings, "I am the ruler and have been for eternities long." In a sense, they describe themselves as being one with the vastness. So, beyond being hateful and angry, I think that black metal is better described as a culture that encourages us to delve deeper, even when it challenges our conceptions of the world as we know it. Black metal lyrics describe eternal winter, ancient realms, grief, and reverence before the natural world. We see vast landscapes, collective memory, and the collapse of ordinary human scale. We get a sense that the people who are writing these lyrics carry very deep emotions, sometimes violent ones, yes, but also emotions that seem too large, too metaphysical, and even too sacred to fit within ordinary contemporary language, like the feeling of instinctively knowing that grimness and vastness is in itself something sacred, and why such landscapes should be guarded and defended. Inevitably, all of this leads us toward one of the most difficult and liminal concepts available to us humans, namely death. Across the board, death is one of the most central concepts to black metal altogether. However, death is usually not described as something to fear, but rather death is described as transition, release, or a dissolution of the self. Burzum sings, "I immaterialize and slowly drift into the unknown." Death often describes an individual's movement out of a false or cramped human order and into something vaster, older, and more enduring, truer, if you will. And for artists who feel alienated from society, from Christianity, from social conventions, and from being fitted into forms that feel deadening, death becomes aesthetically charged as an exit from spiritual and intellectual confinement and movement toward vastness. In dying, the individual merges with something vaster than themselves. as they resituate back into a place where they belong, that is, with ancestry, scale, and eternity. Death implies the individuals merge with the vastness that the music has been circling all along. Burzum describes this transition beautifully in his song Fallen. Høyt der oppe står ei I tiden, I toppen av verdenstreds krone. Fra høyt der oppe faller ei fra tiden, ned det bunnløse, tomme og tidløse. When black metal lyrics keep returning to this yearning for a deeper belonging, to grief, death, and reverence before the natural world, it is immensely difficult to see black metal as a performance of hate for the sake of hate. What I see is that black metal articulates what it feels like to be too much of an outlier for this world. The lyrics reveal inner lives that are emotionally intense. They reveal felt experiences which lack words, and we learn what it feels like to be spiritually estranged from society. Black metal describes what it's like to feel alien in your own time, to feel that the modern world asks you to adapt and distort yourself and become smaller than you really are. Black metal describes worlds where everything is allowed to exist at once. The beauty, the terror, life and death, everything and nothing. Several of these lyrics reveal the importance of scale. And, arguably, a person who prefers to spend their time in solitude in the wilderness understands the temporal and spatial insignificance of one single human. In a human house, the human is important and large. He is in power. He is the commander and decision maker. However, if you place that same human in a snowstorm on a mountain, he is very far from being the center of everything. To think about the insignificance of a human being can feel very unsettling, but black metal has never feared that smallness. In fact, being small and to belong to something much vaster than yourself means being free to assume the shape that is yours. Every individual has their own unique relationship to life, death, sorrow, and everything in between. And naturally, each of the bands that I've mentioned here bring their own philosophy to these questions. But a pattern can only repeat itself for so long before the repetition in itself starts to mean something. And in black metal, those patterns are unmistakable. We hear voices reaching toward something older, harsher, and arguably more honest than what modern society likes to name. Vast landscapes, grimness, ancient memory, and cosmic scale describes intense emotional states. And I get a sense that these states are too profound, dark and sacred to be reduced to spoken language. Because, after all, how would one even go about expressing the grief and longing for ways of existing that were never given the chance of fully taking shape. So, when I look at this art, really look at it, it is impossible to see just violence or just anger. I see search for scale and for a place vast enough to contain sorrow, grief, rage, alienation, awe, beauty, and death all at once. My own thought is that this is exactly why black metal keeps returning to these themes. Because in a world that is obsessed with optimism, ease, and social legibility, black metal keeps insisting on something far more difficult, namely to refuse falseness and to name and embrace the cold and dark landscapes within. This darkness is where some people found the language, the scale, and the landscapes that were vast and real enough to describe what they felt. A vast yearning to belong to something greater, with no other expectations than simply being in the shape of one's true self. And this might actually be one of the most terrifying, beautiful, and honest insights of all. The mountains and the horizons just are. The dormant landscapes and the cosmic darkness, they just are. And in that eternal vastness, we too can simply just be. So, once again, let me ask you, what is your first instinct upon hearing the term black metal?